Chapter 1. The Bustle of Market Day. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the cobbled square where the weekly market thronged with life. Stalls draped in bright awnings lined the high street, their vendors calling out to passers-by with offers of fresh apples, handmade lace, and jars of honey that gleamed like amber. The air was thick with the scent of baked bread, the tang of cheese, and the faint, earthy whiff of autumn leaves swept along by a brisk October breeze. It was the sort of morning that made the village feel at once timeless and vibrantly alive, as if nothing could disturb its cheerful rhythm. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat perched neatly atop her white hair, moved through the crowd with the quiet grace of someone who saw far more than she let on. Her black lace-up shoes tapped softly on the stones as she paused by Mrs. Bantry's flower stall, where dahlias and chrysanthemums spilled over in bursts of crimson and gold. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed from the morning's bustle. "Isn't it a splendid day? Though I dare say the market's busier than ever. That new butcher, Mr. Harrow, has drawn quite a crowd with his sausages." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled as she adjusted her gloves. "Indeed, Dolly. The village does love a newcomer, don't they? Though I wonder if Mr. Harrow finds our little ways overwhelming." Mrs. Bantry laughed, snipping a stem with her garden shears. "Oh, he's a bold one. Already arguing with Mrs. Price over her eggs. Says her prices are daylight robbery." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, but her gaze drifted across the square. She noted the egg stall, where Mrs. Price, a stout woman with a sharp tongue, was gesturing animatedly at Mr. Harrow, whose broad shoulders and ruddy face marked him as a man unused to being crossed. Nearby, young Tom Carter, the baker's apprentice, was stacking loaves with a sullen air, his eyes darting toward a pretty girl selling ribbons at the next stall. Miss Marple's mind, ever sharp, catalogued these details as threads in the village's tapestry. Threads that could, in time, unravel into something altogether more sinister. As she moved toward the tea stall, where Mrs. Green served steaming cups with a cheerful nod, a sudden commotion broke the market's hum. A shout, sharp and urgent, rose from the far end of the square, near the old stone fountain. Heads turned, and the crowd parted like ripples on a pond. Miss Marple, her curiosity piqued, stepped closer, her small frame slipping easily through the gathering onlookers. "What's happened?" Mrs. Green called, craning her neck. "Is it a fight?" "No, no," replied old Mr. Clements, hobbling forward with his stick. "It's worse than that. Someone's collapsed by Mr. Harrow's stall. They're saying he's dead." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Dead? On market day? In the heart of St. Mary Mead? It was unthinkable, yet not, she knew, impossible. People, as she had long observed, were capable of anything, even in the quietest of villages. She reached the edge of the crowd just as Dr. Haydock pushed through, his black medical bag in hand. The doctor knelt beside a crumpled figure sprawled beside the butcher's stall, its awning casting a shadow over the scene. Miss Marple recognized the man at once. Mr. Harrow, the new butcher, his face pale and still, a smear of blood on his apron that looked out of place even for his trade. Dr. Haydock straightened, his expression grim. "He's gone," he said to no one in particular. "Dead as a doornail, and I'll wager it wasn't his heart that did it." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag. She glanced at the stall, noting the neatly arranged cuts of meat, the gleaming cleaver on the counter, and a small, overturned tin of pepper that had spilled across the ground. A trivial detail, perhaps, but Miss Marple had learned never to dismiss the trivial. She turned her gaze to the crowd. Mrs. Price, pale and silent now. Tom Carter, his hands trembling as he clutched a loaf. The ribbon girl, her eyes wide with fear. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her voice soft but laced with a quiet resolve. "It seems market day has brought more than fresh produce to St. Mary Mead." Before we move on, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're craving more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file gets even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. The Body in the Stall. The crowd around Mr. Harrow's butcher stall thickened, their whispers rising like the buzz of bees in a disturbed hive. The golden October light seemed to dim, as if the sun itself recoiled from the grim scene at the heart of St. Mary Mead's market. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the throng, her small figure half hidden by the bustle. Yet her sharp eyes missed nothing. She watched as Dr. Haydock knelt once more beside the body, his fingers probing with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to life's darker moments. "Poison, I'd wager," Dr. Haydock muttered, loud enough for those nearby to catch. He pointed to Mr. Harrow's face, where a faint bluish tinge marred his ruddy complexion. No obvious wounds, save that blood on his apron, and that could be from his trade. But look at his eyes. Dilated, unnatural, something's not right. Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze lingering on the spilled tin of pepper from earlier, now trampled underfoot by curious onlookers. She noted, too, a small glass vial, half hidden beneath a fold of the butcher's apron, its contents glinting faintly in the light. It was empty, but the cork lay a few inches away, as if discarded in haste. She made no move to point it out. Better, she thought, to let the police stumble upon it themselves. They so often needed to feel they were in charge. A young constable, red-faced and flustered, pushed through the crowd, waving his arms ineffectually. "Step back, please. Make way. The inspector's on his way." His voice cracked with nerves, and Miss Marple suppressed a smile. Young Constable Reed was earnest, but he had much to learn about managing a village crowd. Mrs. Price, the egg vendor, stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her ample chest. "It's a scandal, that's what it is," she declared to no one in particular. "A man like Harrow, bold as brass, dropping dead in the middle of market day. I said no good would come of him setting up here, undercutting honest folk." "Oh, come now, Mrs. Price," said Tom Carter, the baker's apprentice, his voice sharp despite his pale face. "He was doing a roaring trade. Maybe someone didn't like that." His eyes flicked toward the ribbon stall, where the girl, Lillian Gray, Miss Marple recalled, was twisting a length of blue satin in her hands, her face ashen. Miss Marple's mind turned over these fragments of conversation, each a piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Price's resentment was palpable, and Tom's defensiveness suggested more than idle gossip. Lillian, too, seemed unnaturally shaken for a girl who barely knew the butcher. Miss Marple filed these observations away, like skeins of wool to be knitted into sense later. The crowd parted again as Inspector Craddock arrived, his tall frame cutting through the villagers with quiet authority. His dark suit was immaculate, but his expression was one of weary resignation, as if he knew St. Mary Mead's peaceful facade hid all manner of secrets. He nodded curtly to Doctor. Haydock then crouched beside the body, his eyes scanning the scene. "Well, Doctor," Craddock asked, his voice low but carrying, "any thoughts?" "Poison, most likely. Dr. Haydock replied, gesturing to the vial Miss Marple had noticed. That might have held it. We'll need a proper analysis, of course, but I'd say he ingested something deadly not long before he collapsed. Craddock picked up the vial with a handkerchief, holding it to the light. No label, curious. He glanced at the stall, where the cleaver still gleamed on the counter, untouched, and no sign of a struggle. Whoever did this was clever. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. If I may, Inspector, might I suggest you examine the pepper tin? It seems out of place, don't you think? Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he knew better than to dismiss Miss Marple's suggestions. He retrieved the tin, sniffing it cautiously. His face tightened. This isn't just pepper. There's something else here. Sharp, chemical. Good catch, Miss Marple. She inclined her head, her expression demure. One does notice things living in a village like this. People are so very careless. Sometimes, as Craddock barked orders to Constable Reed to secure the stall, Miss Marple's gaze swept the crowd again. Mrs. Green, the tea vendor, was whispering to Mr. Clements, her hands fluttering nervously. A man Miss Marple didn't recognize, a stranger in a worn tweed coat, lingered at the edge of the square, his eyes fixed on the scene with an intensity that struck her as odd. And then there was the ledger, half open on the stall's counter, its pages fluttering in the breeze. A quick glance revealed cramped handwriting and numbers that seemed to tell a story of their own. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, her voice barely audible. "It seems Mr. Harrow's stall holds more secrets than sausages." Chapter 3. Whispers Among the Villagers. The market square, so recently alive with the cheerful clamour of commerce, had taken on a hushed, uneasy air. The stalls stood half abandoned, their vendors clustering in tight knots, their voices low but urgent. Mr. Harrow's butcher stall, now cordoned off by Constable Reed's earnest efforts, seemed to cast a shadow over St. Mary Mead. As if the very stones of the high street sensed a wrongness. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat slightly askew from the press of the crowd, lingered near Mrs. Green's tea stall, where a small group had gathered, their whispers as sharp as the autumn breeze. "It's a dreadful business," Mrs. Green said, pouring a cup of tea for Mr. Clements, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Harrow dead? And poison, they're saying. Who'd do such a thing in our village?" Mr. Clements, his gnarled hands wrapped around his stick, shook his head. "He wasn't one of us, was he? Newcomers always bring trouble. I heard he was arguing with half the market last week, Mrs. Price, Tom Carter, even old Mr. Dunley, over his cabbages." Miss Marple, accepting a cup of tea with a polite nod, listened intently, her expression one of mild interest. She knew well that village gossip, like a tangled skein of wool, often held the thread of truth if one knew where to look. "Arguments, you say?" she prompted, her voice gentle. "Mr. Harrow does seem to have stirred things up." "Oh, indeed!" Mrs. Green leaned forward, her eyes bright with the thrill of scandal. "Mrs. Price was fit to burst yesterday. Said Harrow was stealing her customers with his cheap cuts. Called him a cheat right to his face. And Tom Carter, well, he's been mooning over that ribbon girl, Lillian Gray. But I saw him glaring at Harrow something fierce. Jealous, if you ask me." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over these revelations. Jealousy, resentment, these were old motives as familiar to her as the lanes of St. Mary Mead. She glanced toward Lillian Gray's ribbon stall, where the girl stood alone, twisting a length of scarlet ribbon in her hands, her eyes darting nervously toward the butcher's stall. "And Miss Gray," Miss Marple asked softly, "did she have words with Mr. Harrow?" Mrs. Green hesitated, then lowered her voice. Not that I heard, but, well, she was seen talking to him more than once, and not just about sausages. There's talk she owed him money or some such. Her father's been poorly, you know, and ribbons don't pay doctor's bills. Miss Marple nodded, her face betraying nothing. Money troubles, a sick father. Another thread to tuck away. Her gaze drifted to the stranger in the tweed coat, still lingering at the square's edge, his hat pulled low. He hadn't joined the gossip, but his presence was as conspicuous to Miss Marple as a dropped stitch in a perfect shawl. She made a mental note to inquire about him later. As the group continued, Mr. Clements piped up again. And then there's that ledger of his. I saw him scribbling in it yesterday, all secretive-like. Bet it's full of debts folk couldn't pay. A man like that makes enemies. Enemies indeed, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes narrowing. The ledger, with its cramped handwriting, had caught her attention earlier. She wondered what secrets its pages held, debts perhaps, or something more incriminating. Did anyone else notice this ledger? She asked, her tone casual. Mrs. Green frowned. Can't say I did, but Tom Carter was hovering near the stall this morning before it happened. Looked like he was searching for something, now I think of it. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Young Tom, with his sullen air and restless hands, was proving more interesting by the minute. She glanced toward the baker's stall, where Tom was now stacking loaves with unnecessary force, his jaw tight. A boy with a grudge, perhaps, or something to hide. The crowd stirred as Inspector Craddock emerged from the butcher's stall, his face grim. He conferred briefly with Constable Reed, then raised his voice. Right, everyone, back to your business. We'll need statements from anyone who spoke to Mr. Harrow today. No one leaves the market until we've sorted this out. A murmur of protest rose, but Miss Marple noted how quickly the villagers complied, their curiosity tempered by unease. She finished her tea, thanking Mrs. Green with a smile, and stepped away, her mind already weaving the threads of gossip into a pattern. Mrs. Price's anger, Tom's jealousy, Lillian's debts, the stranger's watchfulness, the ledger's secrets, each was a clue, small but significant, like the stitches that held a garment together. As she passed the ribbon stall, Lillian Gray looked up, her eyes wide with something akin to fear. Miss Marple, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, you don't think it was murder, do you? Miss Marple met her gaze, her expression kind but searching. My dear, in a village like this, things are rarely as simple as they seem. But don't you worry. The truth has a way of coming out. With that, she moved on, her small figure blending into the crowd, but her mind as sharp as ever, already unravelling the knot of St. Mary Mead's latest mystery. Chapter 4. The Inspector's Arrival. The market square of St. Mary Mead, though still bathed in the soft glow of the October afternoon, had lost its festive air. The stalls stood quiet now, their wares untouched as villagers lingered in small, wary groups, their eyes darting toward the cordoned-off butcher's stall. Miss Jane Marple stood near the edge of the square, her hands folded neatly over her handbag, observing the scene with the calm detachment of one who knew that truth often hid in the smallest details. Inspector Craddock, his dark suit slightly rumpled from the morning's exertions, stood at the centre of the commotion, directing Constable Reed with a brisk efficiency that belied his inner frustration. He was a man of method, but St. Mary Mead had a way of complicating even the most straightforward cases. He glanced at the crowd, his sharp eyes noting the faces, some familiar, some less so. and then settled on Miss Marple, who offered him a polite, almost apologetic smile. "Miss Marple," he said, approaching her with a nod. "I should have known you'd be here, taking it all in. Any thoughts on this sorry business?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained demure. "Oh, Inspector, I'm just an old woman who notices things. But I dare say you've already seen that vial and the pepper tin. Most curious, don't you think?" Craddock's mouth twitched, a mix of amusement and respect. "Curious indeed. The vial's off to the lab, and that tin, well, it's not just pepper as you pointed out. We'll need to test it properly, but it smells like something chemical. You've a sharp eye, as always." "I merely observe, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "People are so very careless with their secrets, aren't they?" Craddock grunted, turning his attention to the butcher's stall, where Constable Reed was clumsily cataloguing items. The ledger, which Miss Marple had noted earlier, now lay in Craddock's hands, its pages filled with neat columns of numbers and names. He frowned as he flipped through it. Harrow kept detailed records, debts, deliveries, orders, but some of these entries are odd. Look here, LG 5SO'd, urgent. That wouldn't be Lillian Gray, would it? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. It might be, Inspector. Miss Gray is a sweet girl, but her father's illness has strained their means. Debts can make people desperate, you know. Craddock nodded, his face grim. Desperate enough for poison? We'll see. I need to question her, and Mrs. Price, and that lad, Tom Carter. They were all near the stall this morning, and none of them look entirely innocent. As Craddock moved to summon the suspects, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the crowd. Mrs. Price stood by her egg stall, her arms still crossed, her face a mask of indignation. Tom Carter, meanwhile, was wiping flour from his hands, his eyes flickering nervously toward Lillian, who was now packing away her ribbons with trembling fingers. The stranger in the tweed coat, whom Miss Marple had noticed earlier, was gone, but she spotted a cigarette stub where he'd stood, its end still smouldering faintly. "Constable Reed!" Craddock called, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Fetch Mrs. Price first. Let's hear what she has to say about her row with Harrow." Mrs. Price marched forward, her stout frame bristling with defiance. "I've nothing to hide, Inspector," she declared before he could ask a question. "That Harrow was a cheat, undercutting my eggs with his cheap meat. I told him so yesterday, and I'd tell him again if he weren't dead." "And where were you this morning, Mrs. Price?" Craddock asked, his tone even. "Say, around 10 o'clock, when Harrow collapsed." Mrs. Price's eyes narrowed. "At my stall. Where else? Ask anyone. I was selling eggs to Mrs. Bantry and old Mr. Dunley. Never went near Harrow's stall, not once." Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind noting the vehemence in Mrs. Price's voice. It was a touch too forceful, she thought, like a seam stitched too tightly to hide a tear. She glanced at the butcher's stall, where a small crowd had gathered earlier, and recalled Mrs. Price's stall was close enough for her to slip away unnoticed in the bustle. Craddock jotted a note, then turned to Miss Marple. "Anything to add, Miss Marple? You've a knack for seeing what I miss." "Oh, I'm sure you've everything in hand, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild. "Though you might ask Mrs. Price if she saw anyone near Harrow's stall this morning. People do wander, you know, especially on market day." Mrs. Price flushed. "Well, I saw Tom Carter lurking about, now you mention it. Looked shifty, he did, always glancing at Harrow's stall. And Lillian Gray was there too, talking to him earlier. Too close for my liking." Craddock's eyes sharpened. "Thank you, Mrs. Price. That'll be all for now." As she stomped back to her stall, he muttered to Miss Marple, "This is going to be a long day. Too many grudges in this village." "Villages are like that, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly. "They're small, but their secrets are large. And I suspect Mr. Harrow's ledger holds a few of them." As Craddock returned to the stall, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the cigarette stub, then drifted to the ledger in his hands. She thought of Lillian's nervous fingers, Tom's sullen glances, and the stranger who had vanished. The pattern was forming, slowly but surely, like a shawl taking shape on her knitting needles. "Dear me," she murmured, "what a tangled web we weave." Chapter 5. A Question of Alibis. The afternoon sun dipped lower over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the market square, where the air now held a chill that matched the mood of its inhabitants. The stalls, once vibrant with trade, stood forlorn, their vendors subdued as Inspector Craddock's investigation pressed on. Miss Jane Marple lingered near the tea-stall, her keen eyes scanning the scene, as the inspector began questioning the key suspects. She had a way of being present yet unobtrusive, like a shadow that saw everything without being noticed. Inspector Craddock, his notebook open and pencil poised, stood before Tom Carter, the baker's apprentice, whose flour-dusted hands fidgeted nervously. The young man's face was pale, his eyes darting toward Lillian Gray's ribbon stall, before returning to the inspector. "Now, Tom," Craddock began, his tone firm but not unkind. "You were seen near Mr. Harrow's stall this morning, just before he collapsed. Care to tell me what you were doing there?" Tom's jaw tightened, and he shoved his hands into his apron pockets. "I wasn't at his stall, Inspector. I was delivering loaves to Mrs. Green like always. Her stall's just across the way. Ask her if you don't believe me." Mrs. Green, hovering nearby, nodded eagerly. "Oh, he was here, Inspector. Brought me a nice batch of rolls around 9:30. Stayed a minute or two, chatting." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild. "And did you stay long, Tom?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a needle through cloth. "Young men do get distracted, especially on market day." Tom flushed, his gaze flickering to Lillian again. I went straight back to the bakery. Mr. Stokes, my master, can vouch for me. I wasn't near Harrow's stall, I swear." Craddock jotted a note, his eyes narrowing. "We'll check with Mr. Stokes, but Mrs. Price says she saw you lurking, as she put it. Any reason she'd say that?" "She's got it in for me," Tom muttered. "Always has. Thinks I'm trouble just 'cause I don't bow and scrape like she wants." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. She noted the defensiveness in Tom's tone, the way his eyes avoided Craddock's. A young man with a temper, perhaps, or something to hide. She glanced at the butcher's stall, where the ledger still lay under Constable Reed's watchful eye. Its pages, she suspected, held more than debts. Craddock turned to Lillian Gray next, who stood twisting a ribbon so tightly it threatened to tear. Her delicate face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. "Miss Gray," Craddock said, his voice gentler, "your name's in Harrow's ledger. 5 shillings owed, marked urgent. Care to explain?" Lillian's hands froze, and she looked up, her voice trembling. It's true, Inspector. I borrowed money from Mr. Harrow. My father's medicine. It's costly, and my ribbon sales haven't been enough. He said I could pay him back slowly, but he got impatient lately." "Impatient how?" Craddock pressed, his pencil pausing. He came to my stall yesterday, Lillian said, her voice barely audible. Said I needed to pay soon, or he'd tell everyone I couldn't settle my debts. I was going to pay him today, truly, but then... Her voice broke, and she looked away. Miss Marple watched closely, noting the girl's genuine distress, but also the hesitation in her words. Lillian's alibi, she realized, was vague. She'd been at her stall, yes, but the ribbon stall was mere steps from Harrow's. A quick visit, unnoticed in the market's bustle, was entirely possible. "And this morning, Miss Grey," Craddock asked, "where were you when Harrow collapsed?" "At my stall," Lillian said quickly. "I was sorting ribbons. Mrs. Bantry bought some lace from me just before 10. She can tell you." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Mrs. Bantry had been at the flower stall, not buying lace, at the time Lillian mentioned. A small discrepancy, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew how such things could unravel a story. She made a mental note to speak to Mrs. Bantry later. Craddock turned back to the crowd, calling for Mrs. Price, who strode forward with the air of a woman who relished being heard. "I've told you, Inspector," she said before he could speak. "I was at my egg stall all morning. Mrs. Bantry, Mr. Dunley, and half a dozen others saw me. I had no reason to go near Harrow, poison or no poison." "Yet you argued with him," Craddock said, his tone sharp. "Called him a cheat, I hear. That's a strong motive, Mrs. Price." Her face reddened. "I didn't like him, I'll not deny it, but I'd not stoop to murder. Besides, I saw that stranger skulking about, the one in the tweed coat. Looked like he was watching Harrow's stall all morning. Why don't you ask him what he was up to?" Craddock's eyebrows rose. "A stranger? Describe him. Tall, thin tweed coat, hat pulled low," Mrs. Price said, her voice triumphant. "Didn't buy a thing, just stood there, smoking those foul cigarettes. I'd wager he's your man." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag. The cigarette stub she'd noticed earlier, still there, near the square's edge, suddenly seemed more significant. She glanced at Craddock, who was scribbling furiously. "Thank you, Mrs. Price," he said. "We'll look into it." As the suspects dispersed, Miss Marple stepped closer to Craddock, her voice low. "Inspector, you might find it useful to check the times of these alibis. People do get muddled, especially when they're nervous." Craddock gave her a wry smile. "You're thinking they're not telling the whole truth, aren't you?" "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. "But in my experience, alibis are like old lace. Lovely to look at, but they do tend to have holes." As Craddock returned to his notes, Miss Marple's gaze swept the square, lingering on the cigarette stub, the ledger, and the nervous glances of the suspects. The threads of the mystery were tightening, but the pattern was still unclear. "Dear me," she murmured, "how very careless some people are." Chapter 6. Tea and Secrets. The vicarage drawing-room was a haven of calm, its chintz curtains filtering the late afternoon light into a soft golden glow. A fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the polished oak table where a tea tray sat, laden with delicate china cups, a steaming pot, and a plate of scones fresh from Mrs. Hill's oven. Miss Jane Marple sat in a cushioned armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened to the conversation, her mild expression masking the sharpness of her mind. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks still flushed from the market's excitement, poured tea with a practised hand. "It's simply dreadful, Jane," she said, passing a cup to Miss Marple. "A murder, right here in St. Mary Mead." I can't think when we last had such a thing. And poor Mr. Harrow, of all people—" The vicar, Mr. Clement, adjusted his spectacles and frowned. "A most unsettling business. I saw Harrow only last week, you know, at the church fete. Seemed a decent sort, though a bit brash. Not the kind to make enemies, I'd have thought." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the window, where the market square was just visible, now quiet and nearly deserted. "People do surprise one, Mr. Clement," she said softly. "Even the most ordinary folk can have complicated lives." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Complicated, you say? Well, I heard something curious from Mrs. Green at the tea stall. She says Lillian Gray was seen slipping behind Harrow's stall more than once last week. Not buying meat, mind you, just talking, all hushed like. And with her owing him money, it does make one wonder." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze sharpening. "Indeed, Dolly, Miss Gray is such a gentle girl, but debts can weigh heavily. And young Tom Carter, did you notice how he watches her? There's something there, I think." "Oh, Tom!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, buttering a scone with vigour. "He's been sweet on Lillian for months, anyone can see that. But I heard from Mrs. Price, oh, she's a gossip, but she notices things, that Tom and Harrow had a proper row last week. Something about Harrow shortchanging the bakery's meat order. Tom was furious, she said." Mr. Clement raised an eyebrow. "A row? That's news to me. Tom's a quiet lad, usually, though I did see him talking to that stranger in the tweed coat a few days ago, near the churchyard. Looked like a heated exchange." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting. The stranger again. His presence was like a loose thread, tugging at her thoughts. "A stranger, you say?" she prompted, her voice gentle. "Did you catch anything of their conversation, Mr. Clement?" The vicar shook his head. "Not a word, I'm afraid. But the man seemed out of place. City clothes, you know, not quite suited to our village. And he was smoking those strong cigarettes. Left stubs all over the churchyard path." Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling the smouldering cigarette stub near the market square. "How curious," she murmured. "And Mrs. Price, Dolly, did she mention anything else about Harrow? She seemed quite put out by him." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Oh, she's been complaining about him for weeks. Says he was driving her egg trade into the ground with his cheap prices. But here's the odd thing. She told me Harrow had a visitor last month, some man from London, all secretive. Stayed at the Blue Boar and met Harrow late at night. Mrs. Price saw them through her window, arguing by the market fountain." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "A man from London? That's most interesting. And this ledger everyone mentions, did anyone see what was in it?" "Not I," Mrs. Bantry said, shaking her head. "But Mrs. Green said Harrow was always scribbling in it, like it was his life's work. Debts, orders, maybe more. You don't suppose it's connected to the poison, do you, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "Oh, I never suppose, Dolly." "But ledgers do have a way of holding secrets, don't they? Like old letters tucked away in a drawer." As the conversation turned to village matters, Miss Marple's thoughts wove through the new information. Lillian's clandestine meetings with Harrow, Tom's row, the stranger's argument, and the mysterious London visitor, all were threads in a pattern that was beginning to take shape. She thought of Mrs. Price's indignation, too, and how it seemed to mask something deeper, like a curtain drawn over a cracked window. "More tea, Jane?" Mrs. Bantry asked, lifting the pot. "Thank you, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her voice serene. but her mind was far from calm, already sorting through the village's secrets like a knitter untangling a skein. "Dear me," she murmured to herself, "how very many secrets a little village can hold." Chapter 7. The Missing Ledger. The market square of St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy quiet as dusk crept over the village, the stalls now packed away, and the cobblestones glistening faintly under the first stars. A chill hung in the air, as if the day's grim events had cooled the very heart of the village. Miss Jane Marple stood near the butcher's stall, where Constable Reed was still stationed, his youthful face etched with the strain of guarding a crime scene. Inspector Craddock, his notebook tucked away, was preparing to leave for the evening when a shout from the constable broke the stillness. "Inspector!" Reed called, his voice high with alarm. "The ledger! It's gone!" Craddock spun around, his expression darkening. "Gone? What do you mean gone? You were meant to keep an eye on it." Miss Marple, her straw hat tilted slightly as she peered over, watched as Reed gestured helplessly at the stall's counter, where the ledger had lain only hours before, its pages fluttering with secrets. Now the counter was bare, save for the gleaming cleaver and a few scattered bits of twine. Her eyes narrowed, taking in the scene with the precision of a seamstress measuring cloth. "I swear, sir, I didn't take my eyes off it," Reed stammered. "Well, maybe for a moment, when Mrs. Green brought me a cup of tea, but I was right here." Craddock's jaw tightened. "A moment's all it takes, lad. Who was near the stall? Anyone come close?" Reed's face flushed. "Well, sir, there was a crowd earlier. Mrs. Price was by, complaining about her eggs being trampled. And Tom Carter, he came to fetch some twine he'd dropped. Oh, and Miss Gray. She was tidying her ribbons nearby, but she didn't come right up to the stall, I don't think." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind turning over the constable's words. Mrs. Price, Tom, Lillian, all within reach of the stall, all with reasons to want the ledger's contents hidden. She glanced at the ground, noting a faint scuff mark near the counter, as if someone had moved quickly, perhaps in haste. A small detail, but to Miss Marple, no detail was too small. "Dear me," she said softly, stepping closer to Craddock. "It does seem someone was rather eager to keep that ledger from prying eyes, doesn't it, Inspector?" Craddock shot her a glance, half exasperated, half grateful. "You're not wrong, Miss Marple. That ledger had names, debts, maybe even a motive for murder. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were doing." He turned to Reed, his voice sharp. "Round up Mrs. Price, Tom Carter, and Miss Gray. I want to know where they were in the last hour. And search the square. Check the bins, the alleys, anywhere it could have been stashed." As Reed scurried off, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the nearby stalls. Mrs. Price's egg stall was closest, its baskets now neatly packed. But she recalled the woman's earlier agitation, her loud complaints a perfect distraction. Tom Carter's bakery stall was just beyond, and she remembered his restless hands, always fidgeting, as if itching to act. Lillian Gray's ribbon stall, though farther, was still within a quick dash, and her nervous demeanour suggested more than simple grief. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "you might also look at the cigarette stub near the fountain. It's still there, I believe. Our mysterious stranger may not be as far away as we think." Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "You and your cigarette stubs, Miss Marple. I'll have Reed collect it. If that stranger's involved, he's got some explaining to do." As Craddock moved to inspect the stall again, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the square. The stranger in the tweed coat had been mentioned too often to be ignored. Mrs. Price had seen him, Mr. Clement had seen him, and now the cigarette stub tied him to the scene. But the ledger's disappearance was more immediate, a bold move that spoke of desperation. She thought of the scuff mark, the crowd's chaos, and the suspect's alibis, each fraying like old thread under scrutiny. Mrs. Bantry approached, her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, what's this about a missing ledger? I heard Reed shouting from across the square. Do you think the killer took it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, adjusting her gloves. "Oh, Dolly, it's far too early to say. But ledgers are such troublesome things, aren't they? They have a way of showing what people wish to hide." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think it's one of them, Mrs. Price, or Tom, or poor Lillian?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as a whisper, "that someone in St. Mary Mead is very frightened indeed, and frightened people do make such dreadful mistakes." As the square darkened and the villagers dispersed, Miss Marple's mind wove through the day's events. The poison, the vial, the ledger, the stranger. The pattern was growing clearer, like a shawl taking shape on her needles. But one crucial thread was still missing. "Dear me," she murmured, "how very careless some people are." Chapter 8. Shadows in the Alley. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, its pale light casting long, wavering shadows across the narrow alleys that wound behind the high street. The market square, so vibrant by day, was now a silent expanse of cobblestones. The stalls shuttered and the air heavy with the scent of dew-damp earth. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn tightly against the evening chill, walked briskly toward her cottage, her mind still turning over the day's events. The poison, the missing ledger, the elusive stranger in the tweed coat. She had lingered late at the vicarage, discussing the murder with Mrs. Bantry. And now the village was hushed, save for the distant hoot of an owl. As she passed the alley beside the Blue Boar Inn, a faint sound, a rustle followed by a muffled thud, caught her ear. Miss Marple paused, her small frame blending into the shadows, her senses alert. She was no stranger to the ways of villages, where secrets often slipped out under cover of darkness. Stepping quietly to the alley's mouth, she peered into the gloom, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. There, near a stack of crates behind the inn, stood Tom Carter, the baker's apprentice. His silhouette was unmistakable, his broad shoulders hunched as he bent over something on the ground. A soft clink, like metal against stone, echoed faintly, and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the glint of a small object in his hand. A knife, perhaps, or a tool. Tom glanced nervously over his shoulder, his face pale in the moonlight, and Miss Marple pressed, herself closer to the wall, her heart steady despite the danger of discovery. "What are you doing, lad?" A low voice hissed from the shadows, startling both Tom and Miss Marple. A figure emerged, a man in a tweed coat, his hat pulled low, the faint glow of a cigarette tip betraying his presence. It was the stranger, the one Mrs. Price and Mr. Clement had mentioned, his voice sharp with urgency. Tom straightened, shoving the object into his pocket. "None of your business," he snapped, his voice low but defiant. "What are you doing, skulking about? You've no right to be here." The stranger took a step closer, his cigarette casting a fleeting glow across his angular face. "I've as much right as you, Carter, and I know what you're hiding. That ledger didn't vanish by magic, did it?" Miss Marple's breath caught. The ledger, Tom was involved in its disappearance then. Her fingers tightened on her handbag, her mind racing. The stranger's words suggested he knew more than he should. but his presence in the alley, confronting Tom, raised questions of his own motives. Tom's hands clenched into fists. "You don't know nothing," he growled. "And if you're smart, you'll keep your mouth shut. Harrow's dead, and that's the end of it." "Is it?" the stranger said, his voice cold. "Someone made sure of that, didn't they? And I'm betting you know who." Tom took a step forward, his posture threatening, but the stranger held his ground, exhaling a plume of smoke. The tension hung thick in the air, and Miss Marple, hidden in the shadows, felt a prickle of unease. She knew better than to intervene. Two men, one possibly armed, in a dark alley were no place for an old woman. But she memorized every word, every gesture, like stitches in a pattern. Before the confrontation could escalate, a door creaked open at the Blue Boar, spilling light into the alley. "Who's out there?" called Mr. Pye, the innkeeper, his voice gruff. "Show yourselves!" Tom cursed under his breath and bolted down the alley, vanishing into the darkness. The stranger hesitated, then flicked his cigarette to the ground and slipped away in the opposite direction, his footsteps fading quickly. Miss Marple remained still, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She noted the cigarette stub, still smouldering, and the crate where Tom had been crouching. A quick glance revealed a small torn scrap of paper, tucked into a crack in the wood, its edge marked with ink. As Mr. Pye's lantern bobbed closer, Miss Marple stepped back onto the main path, her expression serene. "Just me, Mr. Pye," she called softly, taking the evening air. The innkeeper peered at her, his lantern casting harsh shadows. "Miss Marple, you oughtn't to be out so late, not with a murderer about. Did you see anyone in the alley?" "Oh, just shadows," she said, her voice light. "The moonlight does play tricks, doesn't it?" Mr. Pye grunted, unconvinced, but returned to the inn. Miss Marple waited until his door closed, then stooped to retrieve the scrap of paper, careful not to touch the cigarette stub. She'd leave that for Inspector Craddock. The paper was small, torn from a larger sheet, and bore a single line of cramped handwriting. "LG, 5 shillings paid." But the Moondrilbangu, Lillian Grey, she thought, and a payment made just days before the murder. Curious indeed. Tucking the scrap into her handbag, Miss Marple continued her walk home, her mind weaving the night's discoveries into the growing tapestry of the mystery. Tom's furtive behaviour, the stranger's knowledge, the ledger's significance. It all pointed to a web of secrets tightening around St. Mary Mead. "Dear me," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "How very reckless some people are." Chapter 9. The Market's Hidden Past. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and rose. But the market square remained subdued, its usual bustle dampened by the shadow of murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her small parlour, her knitting needles idle for once as she pored over the scrap of paper she'd found in the alley the previous night. The inked note, LG-5 shillings, paid. 10/3- was a small clue, but to Miss Marple it was a thread in the intricate tapestry of the mystery. She knew the market held secrets older than Mr. Harrow's death, and she resolved to unravel them. After a light breakfast of tea and toast, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat and made her way to the village library, a quaint building tucked behind the church, where Miss Hartnell, the librarian, kept meticulous records of St. Mary Mead's history. The library smelled of old paper and polished wood, and Miss Hartnell, a wiry woman with a penchant for gossip, greeted Miss Marple with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Miss Hartnell said, adjusting her spectacles. "I heard about the dreadful business at the market, Poison, they say. Have you come to look up something about it?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression demure. "Oh, just a little curiosity, Miss Hartnell. I was wondering about the history of our market. It's been a fixture for so long, hasn't it? I thought there might be old records, newspapers perhaps, or council minutes that mention its vendors." Miss Hartnell's eyes lit up, sensing a chance to share her knowledge. "Oh, indeed. The market's been running since the 1700s, you know, though it's had its share of scandals. Let me fetch the archive box from the 20s. There was quite a to-do about 10 years ago, if I recall." As Miss Hartnell bustled to the back room, Miss Marple's mind turned over the clues she'd gathered. The missing ledger, Tom Carter's furtive behaviour in the alley, the stranger's cryptic words, and Lillian Gray's debt. The market, she suspected, was more than a backdrop. It was a stage where old grudges and hidden dealings played out. Miss Hartnell returned with a dusty box, setting it on the table with a thud. "Here we are," she said, pulling out a stack of yellowed newspapers and a leather-bound minute book. "The market had a rough patch in 1925. A vendor, Mr. Grayson, a butcher, funny enough, was caught selling tainted meat. Nearly caused a riot when folk got sick. The council shut his stall down, and he left the village in disgrace." Miss Marple's fingers paused on the edge of a newspaper. "A butcher, you say? How curious! And was there anyone else involved in this scandal?" Miss Hartnell leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Well, it's not in the papers, but there was talk. Grayson had a partner, a man from London who supplied his meat. Shady sort, they said, always meeting late at night. And here's the bit that caused whispers. Mrs. Price's late husband, Mr. Price, was Grayson's assistant. Some said he knew about the tainted meat but kept quiet for a share of the profits." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her face remained placid. "Mrs. Price's husband? How very interesting. And this London supplier? Do we know his name?" Miss Hartnell shook her head. "Not in the records, I'm afraid. He vanished after the scandal broke. But I remember Mrs. Price was furious. Said her husband was innocent, that Grayson tricked him. She's never liked butchers since, you know. Probably why she took such a dislike to Mr. Harrow." Miss Marple nodded, flipping through the minute book. A faded entry caught her eye. A council note from 1925, mentioning a Mr. J. Harrow as a witness in the Grayson case, testifying about meat quality. Her heart quickened. Harrow, a witness in a scandal 10 years prior. It was no coincidence, she thought, that he'd come to St. Mary Mead, setting up a stall in the very market where old wounds lingered. "Thank you, Miss Hartnell," Miss Marple said, closing the book. "You've been most helpful. I think I'll take a stroll to clear my head." As she stepped into the crisp morning air, Miss Marple's mind wove the new information into the pattern. Mrs. Price's connection to the old scandal, Harrow's unexpected link to it, and the mysterious London supplier, perhaps the stranger in the tweed coat? She recalled the cigarette stub, the torn ledger scrap, and Tom's confrontation in the alley. The scandal of 1925, she suspected, was a ghost that had returned to haunt the market. And Mr. Harrow's death was its latest chapter. She paused by the market square, where a few vendors were setting up, their faces wary. Mrs. Price was at her egg stall, her expression sour as she arranged her baskets. Tom Carter was unloading bread, his eyes darting nervously. Lillian Gray, at her ribbon stall, looked pale and distracted, her fingers fumbling with a spool of silk. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, adjusting her hat. The past does have a way of catching up, doesn't it? So Chapter 10. A Dangerous Confrontation. The evening air in St. Mary Mead was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves, the village settling into a restless quiet as the second day since Mr. Harrow's murder drew to a close. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting untouched, her mind weaving through the threads of the mystery. The missing ledger, the 1925 scandal, the stranger in the tweed coat, and the tangled motives of Mrs. Price, Tom Carter, and Lillian Gray. The scrap of paper from the alley, with its cryptic note about Lillian's debt, lay on her table, a small but vital clue. A sudden knock at her door startled her, sharp and urgent in the stillness. Miss Marple rose, her movements calm but cautious, and opened the door to find Lillian Gray, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. The girl's ribbon-trimmed hat was askew, and her hands trembled as she clutched a shawl around her shoulders. "Miss Marple," Lillian whispered, her voice breaking, I didn't know where else to go. Something awful's happened, and I'm frightened." Miss Marple ushered her inside, closing the door softly. "My dear, sit down and have some tea. Tell me everything slowly now." She poured a cup from the pot on her sideboard, her eyes never leaving Lillian's face, noting the girl's nervous glances toward the window. Lillian took the cup with shaking hands. "It was this evening near the market square. I was locking up my stall when someone grabbed me, pulled me into the alley by the Blue Boar. They wore a dark coat, and their voice was low, like they didn't want to be recognized. They said if I told the inspector anything about Mr. Harrow, I'd regret it." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind racing. "Did you see their face, Lillian? Or recognize anything about them? A scent, perhaps? Or the way they moved?" Lillian shook her head, tears welling. "It was too dark and I was so scared. But there was a smell, like those strong cigarettes, the kind the stranger smokes. And their coat, it felt rough, like tweed." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting bag, her thoughts flashing to the cigarette stub she'd seen near the fountain and in the alley. The stranger, then, was more than a bystander. He was a threat. "And what did they think you might tell the inspector?" she asked gently. Lillian's voice dropped to a whisper. "About the money I owed Mr. Harrow. I paid him back, you see, a few days ago, like the ledger said. But he wanted more. Said I knew something about his business, something dangerous. I swear, Miss Marple, I don't know what he meant. I just sold ribbons and tried to keep my father's medicine paid for." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but searching. Lillian's distress was genuine, but her story had gaps, like a shawl with dropped stitches. The payment noted on the ledger scrap, dated just before the murder, suggested Harrow had been pressing her for more than money. And the stranger's threat implied he feared Lillian's knowledge, whatever it was. "Did you tell Inspector Craddock about this payment?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but firm. Lillian's eyes widened. "No, I was afraid it'd make me look guilty. And now someone wants me silent, and I don't know what to do." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've done the right thing coming to me, my dear. Now you must tell the inspector everything, about the payment, the threat, all of it. I'll come with you if you like. It's not safe to keep secrets in a village like this." As Lillian nodded, her tears subsiding, a sharp crack sounded outside, a twig snapping underfoot. Miss Marple's head turned toward the window, her senses alert. She rose, peering through the lace curtains, but saw only shadows moving in the garden, indistinct in the moonlight. Her heart quickened, but her voice remained steady. "Stay here, Lillian. Lock the door behind me." Stepping outside, Miss Marple moved cautiously toward the garden gate, her small flashlight casting a narrow beam. The shadows were empty now, but she spotted another cigarette stub freshly discarded, its end still warm to the touch. Her lips tightened. The stranger, or someone else, was watching, and Lillian's visit had not gone unnoticed. Returning to the cottage, Miss Marple found Lillian pale but resolute. "We'll go to the inspector first thing tomorrow," she said, her tone calm but firm. "But tonight, you'll stay here. My spare room is quite comfortable, and I dare say we'll both feel better with company." As Lillian nodded gratefully, Miss Marple's mind turned over the new threads. The stranger's threat, Lillian's half-truths, the lurking shadow. The 1925 scandal, she suspected, was the key, and someone was desperate to keep it buried. "Dear me," she murmured, locking the door. "How very bold some people are." Chapter 11. Piecing the Puzzle. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across the parlour where she sat with a cup of tea, her knitting untouched on the table. Lillian Gray had left at dawn, escorted by Miss Marple to the police station to share her story with Inspector Craddock. The girl's account of the threatening encounter in the alley, coupled with the cigarette stub and the ledger scrap, had set Miss Marple's mind racing. The threads of the mystery, the poison, the missing ledger, the 1925 scandal, the stranger's presence, were beginning to form a pattern, like a shawl taking shape on her needles. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing as she reviewed the clues. The ledger scrap, with its note of Lillian's payment, suggested Harrow had been pressing her for more than money. Perhaps knowledge of his dealings. The 1925 scandal, involving Mrs. Price's late husband and a disgraced butcher, pointed to old grudges resurfacing. Tom Carter's furtive behaviour in the alley, coupled with his argument with the stranger, hinted at a deeper involvement. And the stranger himself, with his telltale cigarettes, seemed to know too much about Harrow's affairs. She rose, donning her coat and hat, and made her way to the market square, where a few stalls were tentatively reopening. Inspector Craddock was there, conferring with Constable Reed near the butcher's stall, now stripped of its awning and eerily bare. Miss Marple approached, her step light but purposeful. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle. "Any news of the ledger?" Craddock sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not a trace, Miss Marple. We've searched the square, the alleys, even the bins. Whoever took it knew its value. But we did find that cigarette stub you mentioned. Matches the one from the fountain. Same brand, strong and foreign. Our stranger's been busy." Miss Marple nodded, her expression demure. "Indeed, and I wonder, Inspector, if you've considered the market's history. The scandal of 1925, with Mr. Grayson the butcher. I found a record that Mr. Harrow was a witness in that affair. It's curious, don't you think, that he chose to set up shop here, of all places?" Craddock's eyes sharpened. "Harrow, a witness, that's new. And Mrs. Price's husband was involved, wasn't he? She's got no love for butchers, that's clear." "Quite," Miss Marple said, her gaze drifting to Mrs. Price's egg stall, where the woman was arranging baskets with a scowl. "And young Tom Carter, his family's been in the village for years. His father worked at the bakery in 25, supplying bread to Grayson's stall. There may be connections." Craddock frowned, jotting a note. "You're suggesting the past is tied to this murder? That's a leap, Miss Marple." "Oh, I never leap, Inspector," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "But I do notice patterns. The ledger, for instance, it held debts, yes, but perhaps also secrets from that old scandal. Lillian Gray paid her debt, Yet Harrow pressed her for more. Why? And the stranger, his cigarettes mark his presence at every key moment. He knows something, or he wants something. As Craddock mulled this over, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the alley confrontation. Tom's argument with the stranger suggested they shared a secret, perhaps tied to the ledger's disappearance. She recalled the chemical scent in the pepper tin, the vial by Harrow's body, and the scuff mark near the stall. A theory was forming, bold yet plausible, like a stitch that tied loose ends together. She stepped closer to Craddock, her voice low. "Inspector, might I suggest you look into Harrow's suppliers? A man from London was mentioned in the 25 scandal, and Mrs. Price saw Harrow meeting someone from London last month. If that man is our stranger, he may have come to settle an old score, or to silence one." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "You think the stranger's the killer, or that he's tied to this London business?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that someone wanted Harrow's secrets buried, and they've gone to great lengths to ensure it. But secrets, like stitches, have a way of coming undone." As Craddock moved to question Mrs. Price again, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes sweeping the square. Tom Carter was unloading bread, his movements jerky, his glance darting toward Lillian's ribbon stall. Lillian herself was absent, likely still shaken from the previous night's threat. And Mrs. Price, her face set in a grim line, seemed to watch the inspector with a wariness that spoke volumes. Miss Marple's theory was bold, but it fit the clues. Harrow, a witness to the 1925 scandal, had returned to St. Mary Mead, perhaps to exploit old secrets. The ledger held proof, debts, yes, but also names tied to that disgrace. The stranger, possibly the London supplier from years ago, had a stake in keeping those secrets hidden. And Tom, Lillian, or Mrs. Price, or all three, had been drawn into a web of fear and desperation, one that led to poison and a missing ledger. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, adjusting her hat, "how very intricate this pattern has become." Chapter 12. The final stall. The vicarage drawing-room was aglow with lamplight, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill of secrets that hung over St. Mary Mead. Inspector Craddock had gathered the key figures in the Market Square murder: Mrs. Price, Tom Carter, Lillian Gray, and a few curious villagers, at Miss Marple's suggestion. The room was crowded, the air thick with anticipation as chairs scraped and teacups clinked. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting in her lap, her eyes bright with the clarity of a puzzle finally solved. The missing ledger, the cigarette stubs, the 1925 scandal, all had woven into a pattern she could now reveal. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his notebook closed, his expression one of reluctant trust in Miss Marple's instincts. "Right then," he began, his voice carrying authority. "We're here to settle this matter. Mr. Harrow's murder wasn't chance, it was planned, and the killer's among us. Miss Marple, you've something to say." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Indeed, Inspector, it's a sad business, but the truth must out. Mr. Harrow's death was no sudden act of passion. It was rooted in the past in a scandal that left wounds in this village." She turned her gaze to Mrs. Price, whose stout frame stiffened. "Mrs. Price, you've spoken often of your dislike for Mr. Harrow, how he undercut your egg trade. But it wasn't just business, was it? Your late husband, Mr. Price, was entangled in the 1925 scandal with Mr. Grayson, the butcher. He was accused of knowing about tainted meat but kept silent. For profit. You've carried that shame ever since." Mrs. Price's face reddened. "That's old history. My husband was innocent, tricked by Grayson. I had no quarrel with Harrow beyond his prices." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Perhaps. But Mr. Harrow was a witness in that scandal, testifying against Grayson, and, indirectly, your husband. When he came to St. Mary Mead, you feared he'd stir up that old shame. His ledger, with its detailed notes, might have held proof of your husband's guilt, or perhaps your own dealings with him. Mrs. Price sputtered, but Miss Marple raised a hand, turning to Tom Carter. "And you, Tom. You're a loyal lad, but your temper's known. You argued with Harrow over a short-changed meat order, but there was more, wasn't there? Your father worked at the bakery in 25, supplying Grayson's stall. He too was tainted by that scandal. When Harrow arrived, you worried he'd expose your family's past, or worse, demand payment for his silence." Tom's hands clenched, his voice hoarse. "I didn't kill him. I was at the bakery, like I said." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "But you were in the alley that night, hiding something. The ledger, perhaps? You were seen with the stranger, who seemed to know your secrets." She turned to Lillian Gray, whose pale face was taut with fear. "And you, my dear, you owed Harrow money, but you paid it back, as the ledger scrap showed. Yet he pressed you for more, not money, but information. You knew something about his dealings, didn't you? Something dangerous, tied to that stranger in the tweed coat." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean to. He asked me to watch for a man from London, said he'd pay my debts if I did, but I didn't know what it meant." Miss Marple nodded, her voice steady. "And that brings us to the stranger, the key to this puzzle. His cigarette stubs marked his presence at every turn, and he threatened you, Lillian, to keep you silent. He was no stranger to Harrow, though. He was the London supplier from the 1925 scandal, come to St. Mary Mead to silence Harrow, who was blackmailing him with proof of their old dealings." The room gasped, and Craddock leaned forward. "The stranger? You're saying he's the killer?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Not quite, Inspector. The stranger, Mr. Vincent, as I've learned, had motive, but he didn't act alone. The poison in the pepper tin, the vial, the ledger's disappearance, all point to someone closer, someone who knew Harrow's habits, someone who could slip poison into his tea, which he drank every morning at his stall." She turned to Mrs. Price, her voice calm but unrelenting. "Mrs. Price, you were seen near Harrow's stall that morning, despite your claims. You brought him a cup of tea, a neighbourly gesture, you said. But that tea held poison, didn't it? You knew Harrow's ledger could ruin you, linking your husband, and perhaps you, to the old scandal. You took the ledger after he collapsed, hiding it to protect your name." Mrs. Price's face drained of colour. "That's a lie! I never touched him." Miss Marple sighed. "You were careful, but not careful enough. The scuff mark by the stall, the chemical scent in the pepper tin, it was a clever ruse to mask the poison's taste. And the stranger, Mr. Vincent, was your accomplice. You met him years ago, through your husband's dealings with Grayson. When Harrow returned, you both feared exposure. You poisoned him, and Vincent ensured the ledger vanished, threatening Lillian to keep her quiet." Craddock stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Mrs. Price, have you anything to say?" Mrs. Price's defiance crumbled, her shoulders sagging. I couldn't let him ruin us again. He was going to tell everyone about my husband, about me. Vincent helped, but I put it in his tea." The room fell silent, the villagers staring in shock. Lillian sobbed softly, and Tom's face was grim. Craddock signalled to Constable Reed. "Take Mrs. Price into custody and find this Vincent. We've got his description." As Mrs. Price was led away, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. "Dear me," she murmured, "how very tragic it is when old wounds fester." Chapter 13. After the market closes. The market square of St. Mary Mead had regained its familiar rhythm, the stalls once again brimming with apples, lace, and the hum of village life. A week had passed since Mrs. Price's confession and arrest, and the village, though still abuzz with whispers, was settling back into its quiet routines. The October sun shone gently, casting a warm glow over the cobblestones, as if to erase the shadow of the recent tragedy. Miss Jane Marple sat on a bench near the old stone fountain, her knitting in her lap, her eyes taking in the scene with a serene yet watchful air. Mrs. Bantry approached, her arms full of chrysanthemums from her stall, her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, you've done it again," she exclaimed, settling beside her. "Mrs. Price, of all people! And that dreadful Mr. Vincent, caught trying to slip away on the London train. How did you know?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her smile faint but knowing. "Oh, Dolly, it was simply a matter of seeing the pattern. People are so very predictable, you know, when they're frightened." Mrs. Price carried the weight of her husband's shame from 1925, and when Mr. Harrow returned, threatening to expose it, she acted out of fear. Mr. Vincent, his old supplier, was just as desperate to keep their past buried. It's sad, really, how far people will go to protect their secrets. Mrs. Bantry shook her head, arranging her flowers. "And poor Lillian Gray, caught in the middle? She's looking better now, though. Says she's selling more ribbons than ever, thanks to the village's sympathy." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to Lillian's stall, where the girl was tying a bright blue ribbon for a customer, her smile tentative but genuine. "Lillian was fortunate," she said softly. She knew little of Harrow's schemes, but enough to make her a target. "I'm glad she's safe now. And Tom Carter?" Mrs. Bantry asked, lowering her voice. "He's been quiet as a mouse since it all came out." "Tom was angry, not guilty," Miss Marple replied. "His family's tie to the old scandal made him wary of Harrow, and he took the ledger to protect his father's name, not knowing Mrs. Price had already acted. He's young, Dolly, and youth often acts before it thinks." The ledger, recovered from a crate behind the bakery, had confirmed Miss Marple's theory. Harrow's notes detailed not only debts, but also his blackmail scheme, leveraging secrets from the 1925 scandal. Mrs. Price's entries hinted at payments to keep her husband's role quiet, while Vincent's name appeared in coded references to London deliveries. Inspector Craddock, much to his chagrin, had admitted Miss Marple's insight had cracked the case. As the market bustled around them, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the butcher's stall, now occupied by a new vendor, a cheerful man from a neighbouring village. The cleaver, the pepper tin, the vial, all were gone, evidence in Craddock's custody. The cigarette stubs had led to Vincent's capture, his foreign brand betraying him as he tried to flee. Justice, Miss Marple thought, had a way of catching up, like a stitch that completes a row. "You must be pleased, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, breaking her reverie. "Another mystery solved, and St. Mary Mead safe again." Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile. "Pleased? Perhaps, Dolly, but I take no joy in it. People do such foolish things when they're afraid. Mrs. Price, Vincent, even Tom. Human nature is a curious thing, so full of flaws, yet so predictable." She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag. "Now, I must be off. My roses need tending, and I've a mind to bake a sponge for the vicar's tea tomorrow." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "You're incorrigible, Jane, but I'll wager you're already watching for the next mystery." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she adjusted her hat. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, Dolly. But in a village like ours, one never knows what the next market day might bring." As she walked home, her step light on the familiar cobblestones, Miss Marple's mind was already at rest, the pattern complete. "Dear me," she murmured, "how very like a village life is to a piece of knitting, full of knots, but always coming together in the end."